everyone, welcome to my latest video on the power of double rooks on the second rank. I've played several recent games that were decided by a perpetual or mating net executed by two rooks stacked on the second rank. These situations arose in calculation-heavy situations where one side had a dangerous passed pawn. However, once my double rooks came into play, the entire direction of the game shifted. When two rooks are connected on the second rank, a synergy is created. Each rook is no longer worth only 5 points each, but now they have a bond that can easily translate into a substantial material gain, a much-needed perpetual, or even a mating net if your opponent isn't careful. In this video, I want to share with you several examples that demonstrate the enormous leverage double rooks offer. The main takeaway that I want you to come away with is to recognize the critical points in the game where you may be faced with the decision to exchange rooks or perhaps sacrifice material, but have the option of doubling your rooks on the second rank. When your stacked rooks will be effective depends on many factors. I hope my examples can shed some light on when and how you can maximize their power. I'm going to start with a few basic instructional examples. I'm sure all of you are familiar with them, but before your eyes glaze over, trust me when I say they are worth repeating so you can see the parallels between them and real game situations. What's interesting about the second-ranked double rooks is that their functionality always remains the same, and it's more about learning how to maximize other dynamics of the position to assist them. Afterwards, I'm going to show you an excerpt of a game against IM Dean Ippolito from my upcoming DVD on converting advantages, where I missed the opportunity to create a decisive mating net using double rooks. Next, in the spirit of my previous video on fighting in the endgame, we'll look at how double rooks saved a lost position and helped me win, and we'll finish off with the recent game from the US Amateur Team East, where the double rooks, combined with the nature of team tournaments, created an unusual situation that I'd like your input on. Okay, let's get started with the basics. Every beginner is exposed to double rooks early on when taught how to checkmate. For example, everyone knows how to do this. But in real practical situations, this isn't likely to happen. Your opponent will probably resign before even reaching this. Something like this is a lot more likely. So take a minute to look at this position. Now, white has a very dangerous pass c6 pawn, but black has two very powerful double rooks on the second rank. So what happens if white goes c7 to try and promote the passed pawn? Then black checks. And unlike the previous basic example, black can't checkmate so easily. Obviously here, black just loses the rook, and if he tries to check the king, then the king runs away, but always remains attacking the rook, so a simple checkmate like that is impossible. But what black can do here is protect the rook with f3, and lo and behold, no matter what white promotes his pawn to, he can't stop black's checkmate. Now, this is a very basic example, but it's worth keeping in mind because oftentimes you can force your opponent's hand if you can manage to protect one of the rooks on the second rank. In this case, it's with the pawn, but in real games, it may be with the knight or with the bishop. So in this example, if white tries to prevent black from promoting his pawn to f3 with rook f1, remember this mating net, this is already a checkmate. Now it's obvious, but it comes in useful because the king and rook are naturally in this position after castling. So what white should try and do is stop the pawn from promoting this way, but then all black has to do is go g4, continuing with the plan, and again after c7, we can check and go f3. Okay, simple enough. Let's complicate the example a bit more. Okay, in this example, it's black to move. There's no immediate checkmate on the horizon again, and there is no clear way to protect one of the rooks to create the checkmate. And in the meantime, white is threatening to take the pawn on a6, and it's difficult for black to protect it. But because of the double rooks, he can make white's next few moves a lot more difficult to execute. Now what black may want to try and do immediately is take on d2 here. But that won't work because the rook takes a6, and white wins the material. And in the meantime, black doesn't want to go for the perpetual. So what he starts off doing is going rook g2 check, king f1. Now you can't checkmate, you can't go rook h1 now, but what you can do is go rook takes d2. So see, instead of taking on d2 immediately, first you gain the tempo by checking, and now either rook d1 or rook h1 is a real threat. So white can't block on the first rank with either of his rooks or pieces, so what he has to do is protect with his king by attacking one of the rooks, for example, king e1. But then you keep doing the same thing, and you keep sweeping on the second rank. So in the previous examples, we saw mating nets with the rooks, and this is what I call sweeps, because you just keep taking what you can. And now if king d1, you just keep going. And once this position is reached, now what you can do is swing your rook back, and mate is inevitable. Okay, so keep these in mind, and we will build on these, and you'll be surprised at when these patterns come up in real games. Okay, now we're going to move over to a game that I played, where if I had kept the possibilities of mating nets with double rooks in mind, I may have been able to score a win against a very strong opponent. IM Dean Ippolito. This game is from the 5th New York International Open in 2012, hosted by the Marshall Chess Club. Now, I'll go over this game in more detail in my next video on converting advantages, because it was a very interesting game with a lot of rich variations. But here we're going to fast forward to move 40, where I just trapped his rook. We exchanged. So this is move 40, I'm white, and the opening was a Caro-Kann. Now take a moment to absorb the position. So I managed to force him to give up the exchange, but he has a dangerous passed g-pawn. My rook on a8 may be a bit slow in protecting that, and then in the meantime, he has a knight that can either check me and try and attack the rook, or in some way help his pawn promote while it protects the pawn, and he can try and go something like rook f5, rook f2. So I have to immediately block the pawn. Okay, now what I want to do is create my own pass pawn here. It'd be easy to take the pawn on a6, but black can go rook f3. And then I have to exchange, but then I won't be able to catch the f-pawn in time. So I can't do that. But I go rook g1. He moved his rook from the g file, so he can't promote his pawn to g2 in the meantime, and this escapes from that rook f2 check. Okay, so now we move back and forth. I did this to see what his intentions are, which gives me time to decide whether a draw is inevitable or if I should fight on. And I decided to keep going because I saw that I could escape from the perpetual. Here I have two options. I can either go king c4 or king c2. King c4 looks a bit more natural because it looks like it's making the king more active, but it exposes the king to this check on d2. And now black can go rook a3 swing his rooks over to the queen side and end up going after my pawns before I have a chance to take any of his. Of course, after rook a3, you'll see that he's threatening this fork, so I can't take on a6. I have to go rook g2. He still checks me. And then it creates this messy situation that I'd rather avoid. So instead of king c4, I decided to go with king c2, which avoids any checks by the knight in the meantime, because the knight is the more dangerous piece in this position, and I want to prevent him from managing to swing his knight over with extra tempos by checking me. So he goes knight c3. And now is a good time to pause the video and take a few minutes to consider the best way for white to proceed. Okay, before I tell you what the right move here is, let me go over what I did in the game. I played king d2. This is move 49. It's a natural looking move that brings the king closer to the troublesome g3 pawn and protects the e2 square, because he's of course threatening to go knight e2, rook f2. And after that, this is what happened. I managed to take the a6 pawn. He won some of my pawns. But he got his pawn too far, and I was forced to give up my rook. I got my own passed a pawn. And here, even though I was slightly better, the game ended in a draw. But going back to that critical position, instead I had an immediate win here that would put me at least +5, if not a checkmate within the next few moves. And the right move here is rook e1. And if you found this move, congratulations, because neither I or my opponent, who is a strong 2500 IM, saw this move during the game. And this was even after time control was made after move 49. And why does rook e1 work? Well, if he goes g2, I have rook e8. This is another possible mating net with the two double rooks. We looked at how powerful the double rooks were on the second rank, but they can also be extremely powerful on the back rank. And the reason this works here is because I have this pawn on h5 that's blocking the king from coming over to g6. So I don't quite exactly remember what I was thinking during the game, but I thought I may have seen this move, but I imagined that he would, okay, well, first of all, if he queens, then that's the simple checkmate. But I thought that he'd be able to protect himself by giving his king some rooks. So let's say he checks first to try and provoke me into moving my king, maybe somewhere to c1 so he can queen with a check. But all I have to do, I don't even have to take the knight and go through him going rook f3 and checking me. I can just hide behind his knight, king b3. So no more immediate checks unless he wants to give up his rook on b2, which wouldn't really work. And now let's say he goes g6. Well, what I had focused on during the game was rook h8 here, and then his king can escape, and the best that I can do here is to keep checking him in the back, and he can't make any progress by going king e6 because I can take this pawn, but he can just keep moving back and forth. But instead, after g6, all I need to do is either with the a8 rook or the e8 rook, just check him. Very simple. And suddenly it's checkmate, you know. And I mean, the same holds if he moves g5 instead of g6. So going back to this position, all he can really do to try and stop that is give up his knight. Can go knight e2. But then I can go f8 right in time, and I'm simply up a rook. If he goes knight e4, no. Same thing, I'm just a clean rook up, and that's really all he can do to try and stop this checkmate. So this is why it's important to keep those double rook mating nets in mind. Okay, and as I said, I'll go over this game in more detail because I also missed a way to convert an advantage early on in the game. But this game does provide a great example for how to leverage the power of double rooks. Okay, now let's move on to another game. This time I'm black against Christopher Wu, who is a talented young player. And this time the double rooks did help me win, but I was actually worse. I was a pawn down. I messed up the opening move order, but managed to gain a lot of activity for my pieces thanks to the double rooks. Okay, we have a Sveshnikov here. I'm not going to spend too much time on the opening moves. Okay, it's move 16. I moved knight e7, which is a typical Sveshnikov move, but it doesn't work out here. I suddenly found myself down a pawn after this. I can take the knight on f5 because queen d5 check, and I can't defend the rook. So I have to leave the knight there. And I have to create the most of the situation here. Those of you who have watched my previous video on fighting in the endgame know that this is not yet a time to give up. I went queen f7, tried to create some activity. He went g4, which is the right move, protects the knight, and because I don't have a light squared bishop, there's nothing I can do about attacking his knight any further, but g4 does create some weaknesses, and it did help me later on in the game. Okay, now I'm down a pawn, but I have some activity, so I try and continue with the typical Sveshnikov breakthroughs with b4. Okay, he went queen b3, solid move, but here he probably could have even taken on b4, because after queen c4, he has this nice queen d5 tactic. And he exchanges into a favorable endgame, 2 pawns up. But as I went over in my fighting video, a lot of times the side with the advantage begins to play it too safe. After queen b3, I take on c3, and at least I managed to create an isolated pawn for him. I go e4, provoking white into exchanging the bishop so I can go into a double rook ending, which will give me better draw chances. But his knight on f5 is too powerful. It protects the d6 pawn, so instead he spends a move protecting c3. He continues to resist, but by doing so allows me to quickly activate all of my pieces. At least after something like rook b8, I am fully developed. And compared to 4 moves ago, when he initially went knight takes f5, my position here isn't that tragic. So now he exchanges queens, which he probably is happy to do because he's a pawn up. Rook b2. Okay, now I have something to work with. I'm on the second rank here, attacking his a2 pawn because his pawn is on g4. I may be able to exploit the weaknesses that he created around his king. Even though I don't have a queen, the 2 rooks together are powerful enough. Okay, now I have to worry about protecting my d6 pawn. White is doing everything right. He's moving his pawns to light squares out of the way of my bishop and clamping down on my own structure. I have few resources left, but I do have one move here that completely disrupts White's plans. Take a moment to think about what I played here. Okay, keeping the power of the double rooks in mind, I would love to get the d7 rook to the second rank. However, that is too slow to do by traditional means. If I try and go rook a2, he goes c5 here, and I lose the d6 pawn. Because again, if I go d5, he can take on d5 and then fork me with knight e7. So instead of going that route, I take advantage of White's overextension early on in the game and play h5. Now the computer will still think that White is winning here, and that's probably true. But this is a powerful psychological move. I go over these types of moves more in my other video on fighting in the endgame. White would have preferred to go through with his plan of c5, possibly winning the e4 pawn and winning in the quiet endgame. However, this move changes the course of the game. Black now has an initiative and is taking control. Even if I am material down, I'm at least taking control of the direction of the game, and that is crucial to fighting back. Now after h5, take a moment to consider the best way for White to counter this move. Okay, now the best way for White to proceed is to go c5, but not to win the d6 pawn, because he'd have to give up the g4 pawn, and instead he has to focus on promoting the c pawn, which would require a refocus. Because before he was probably aiming to win the d6 pawn, and now he has to kind of shift into passed pawn mode. And this would require finding some accurate moves here. It looks like I'm threatening to win the c6 pawn, so when you're calculating this position in your head over the board, it's probably hard to come up with moves like knight f5 here, just moving the knight back. Of course, I can't take the c6 pawn, because again, this tactic. So I'd have to go something like king f7, and, you know, it's still a game, but White definitely is better here. So that would have actually been the best way to counter h5. I mean, if I'm able to provoke him into either protecting g4 with h3 or doing something on the king side against h5, then I've already won a mini psychological battle in a way, because I've dictated the terms of the position. I was expecting him to go something like h3, which preserves the status quo of the position, but then I would begin to use the h-file, which is now available to me. It wasn't open a few moves ago. Now I can go rook h7, and before it would have been difficult for me to go rook a2, rook d7, b7, b2, but it's suddenly a lot easier for me to go rook h7, rook h2, and take control of the second rank that way. Now if he continues with his plan and goes c5, then I don't take on c5 here, because that gives him a lot of activity with his own rooks. And instead of going rook h2 immediately, I can try and do that with the tempo. I can go bishop h2 check. Now bishop f4. Now that bishop turned out to be quite powerful here. He's moving in between the knight. The knight is strong on f5, but it's not really good at blocking my black bishop. Now I attack the rook on c1. He has to do something. He can ignore that threat for a little bit by trying to promote his pawn, but now I can go rook h2 with the check, with the tempo. And he has to be careful here, because if he goes king f1, then I take. You know, we see that double rook pattern emerge here. And I can go e3. I don't have a pawn on f4 to go to f3, and I can't use the dark bishop to defend the rook on g2, but I can still use it to support the promotion of the e-pawn. And after something like this, I'm much better, and he has to go Rook E1 to stop the pawn from promoting. And even though I can't use the bishop to try and protect the rooks to force a checkmate, I can use it to swing it over to a5 and stop him from promoting, and then I'm just up a rook. Instead of going king f1 here after the check, he has to go king g1. And then, since I'm now a tempo down compared to the previous position, I can't go e3 so quickly, so here I would have to go for the perpetual. But again, because I am a pawn down, he is higher rated than me, and I'm black, I'm completely fine with that. And of course, since he has the advantage, psychologically it's difficult to adjust to a situation where you have to defend, and white really does want to win here and prove that he won the pawn and he can convert that. So those are also some factors to continue here, because maybe if we had even pawns, he would be fine with the draw because he would recognize how dangerous my pieces have become. But he didn't go h3, he took the pawn. You know, he's saying, okay, you want to sacrifice another pawn? Well, let's see how you're going to convert here. Okay, now take another moment to think about the best way for black to continue. Okay, the natural move here is rook h7. But then he can defend the pawn, knight g3, and I still have some play with rook f7. Now I can win the f2 pawn, but I have something much easier and quicker here. Did you find bishop takes h2 check? Now wow, suddenly the geometry of the position comes alive here. If he takes on h2, then I take on f2. So I've won back two pawns, the h2 pawn and the f2 pawn, win back my piece very easily. And now the pawn count has evened out. But I have a dangerous passed e-pawn, his pawn in h5 is about to fall, and his king is exposed. So white doesn't want to go into this. So after losing the h2 pawn, he realizes that if he still wants to win, then he has to run and go king f1. Okay, now it's a bit difficult for me to penetrate with my two rooks. But I can go rook h7, go after his other pawn. Now, he can defend it indirectly by going rook d5 if I take on h5, again with that pesky knight e7 check. So I go bishop e5, which renews the threat of taking on h5, and at the same time opens up the h2 square for my rook. So if he takes here, I can take, and he goes king g2 because I'm threatening to go rook h1 and win the rook on c1. And now I can get something like this, where again I have two very powerful double rooks on the second rank and a dangerous passed pawn that even though I can't use to checkmate, I can use to support my rooks in this manner. I have this nice tactic here. So instead of taking, he decides to protect the pawn in h5 by going knight g3. Now I already have a draw here if I want to take it. But I have something even better. I go e3, and even though white is a pawn up, suddenly black is better. Again, it's using all of my pieces are all coordinated, they're very active, they're all harmonious, and e3 puts pressure on the f2 pawn with the help of the rook on b2, and at the same time the knight on g3 becomes vulnerable, and the knight on g3 protects the pawn in h5, which itself becomes vulnerable, so white's position is falling apart here. Okay, now I played e takes f2 here, which was an error because he had the saving rook takes e5 here. Because if I take, then he forks, and he comes away with the passed c pawn. That's hard for me to stop, even though I could probably maybe get a draw there. And if I go rook g7, then he goes rook g5. Again, thanks to the protection of the knight. So what I could have done here is went e2. And I'm still winning here. But I played e takes f2. He continues with his original plan of going c5. I don't want to belabor my other video, but I do go over these sorts of psychological situations where the side with the advantage keeps going forward with his plan, and then the side that's resisting can end up creating counterplay that way that could end up saving the position. So you go c5, and instead of going after the h5 pawn, and you see why I can't take here, because knight f6 check. So I go rook g7 instead. And now he's forced to take on f2. I'm threatening checkmate. And I go rook f7, even though bishop h2 here would have been even quicker. But rook f7 is the natural move. And I'm still winning here. He does have a passed d pawn. It does look like I may need to sacrifice material to stop it. But I have the initiative here with the double rooks. With rook h g2 check, this is move 39. So we're low on time here, and this is one of those critical moments. Well, let me just say that if he goes king f1 here, then I go bishop h2, and I'm fine. He can't stop the mate. But he makes the correct move with king h1, so I have to make my 40th move here. I have to make time control. It's a very pressurized situation. If I go rook h2, then I can't go back to g2 next move because it's the threefold repetition, so I essentially have to decide between whether going for the draw here or trying to win here. And even though 10 moves ago I would have been ecstatic with the draw, I have to be able to readjust my mindset to realize, well, I can actually win here. And I made the right move, rook g5. And now the other rook springs to life, and I'm threatening checkmate with rook h2 check. That's another type of mating net with the double rooks to keep in mind. So instead of the second rank, I'm kind of shifting over to playing with the double rooks on the h and g files. He takes on e5, which is, of course, the right move. Now I recapture. He goes d7. It looks like I can't stop the pawn. If I go rook d5, he goes rook c8 check. And queen's next move evens out the material. So, you know, this is the last point in the game where I'll ask you to pause and consider where you would go here. Now I go rook d2, and I had to see this when I played rook g5. Because now after rook c8 check, no matter what he promotes his pawn to, it's a checkmate. So, I mean, remember the very first thing that I went over in this video was that basic, how to checkmate with the double rooks. Well, here you go in action, in the real game. And of course, after rook d2, well, there's nothing he can do at this point. He can't defend the d7 pawn, and that's the only thing he has going for him in this position. So he ended up resigning. But I do also want to point out that if I had taken on h5 first, if I had become greedy and went after his pawn, I wouldn't have been able to do the same thing with rook d2, because now there's no more checkmate on e1. So that's another thing to keep in mind, that sometimes it's better to have your rook farther away from the king. And that's how I ended up winning this game, with the power of the double rooks. Okay, now the last game of this video was played just a few weeks ago at the US Amateur Team East. It's a very fun tournament, but the team competition does add an interesting twist to the games, because now not only are you worried about your own results, but you're also worried about the team results. So that, combined with the perpetual options that the double rooks offer, created for an interesting situation that I'll get to in a second, and that I'd be interested in getting your feedback on, whether I made the right decision. So this is round 3 of the competition. I am black against Alex King, who is a strong 2300 and was playing with a team of other players from the famous Marshall Chess Club in New York. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time on the opening, but it was an unorthodox Benko. Okay, we get to this position where I managed to give up the pawn in exchange for doubling his pawns on the f-file and opening the g-file, along with the very strong pawn center. Again, he takes because he wants to avoid d4. King h1, and this is typical. It looks like I may have the initiative, but I don't have anything immediate, so I proceed with developing. I want to distract him on the king side, but my true intention is to try and play on the queen side, because that's where black wants to direct his energy in the Benko. Queen b3 is a nice way to defend the pawn. Can't really take it, because then my pawns become very vulnerable, and he has control of all the files. So I move back, but now his queen on b3 may fall under some threats by rook b8 or c4. He goes rook g3. He wants to play on the king side and double up the rooks. But if he really wanted to double, rook g2 would have been the safer route, because now I can go knight e7 and have it swing to f5 in just one move. And after I do that, then rook h6 and knight h4 does become dangerous for white. So he goes f4 to try and cut my queen off of that b8 h2 diagonal. Now I create some counterplay by prying open the f-file. And I don't even want to go knight f5 now, because I can double up my rooks at any moment and put some pressure on the f2 pawn. Okay, so he's threatening the d5 pawn here. I can't take on f4, because similar to what happened in the Sveshnikov game, he would be able to create a double attack on my king and rook. After rook d8, which is the key move here, I have a slight edge. Everything started going my way after the subtle knight e7. He goes b3. Now I double up on the f-file. He goes bishop g2. I was really taken aback by this move, because after I thought that he would try and go king g2 to protect the bishop. And I can't go knight f5 here, because the d5 pawn is hanging, so I'd probably have to go c3, preserve my edge this way. But after bishop g2, I can simply take on f2. But he has a simplifying tactic in mind. Now, after d takes c4, he can force an exchange of queens, and his light-squared bishop is very powerful in that position. So what I would love to do here is go rook d2. And he can't take on d2 because I take on a1. He has to give up the bishop. And if I can get his queen to move out of the way, then I can go rook f2 or knight f5 after that. But what he can do here is bishop takes d5. It's an intermediate move and a discovery combination that discovers a defense to the check, because now he has rook g1. And he's up material in that position, so I can't go rook d2, I have to recapture. He goes queen d4, I'm forced to exchange. Now this is where it gets interesting, because it looks like his pawn on a2 is just going to run down the board. And it's hard for me to stop it. At the same time, I want to win the d4 pawn because it is loose. I think he was expecting me to go knight f5 here to try and fork the rook and the pawn, but then he can go rook c3. And it's even pawns, but still it's going to be difficult for me to stop that pawn. And if I go rook d8, then he just starts moving his pawn, and I have to try and exchange the rook on a1 to try and get my rook behind the pawn. But in all of these scenarios, white is the one controlling the game, and I have to start defending against the a pawn. So the resource that I found here, and take a moment to think about the best way to combat white's plans, is rook d2. And this was a nice compromise between going after the d4 pawn, but at the same time providing enough counterplay that white doesn't have enough time to start promoting the a pawn. He went a4, and instead of taking on d4 and allowing him to go a5, I decide to double up my rooks on the second rank by going rook f2. And this creates a lot of rich possibilities for me. If I'm able to go c3 next move, then after c2, rook d1 is a real threat, and I end up queening first. And along with that, knight f5 is also a threat here. So I don't even want to win the d4 pawn, because these two rooks on the second rank, like I mentioned before, create a synergy that is worth a lot more to me in this position. a5, then c3. So he found a good defensive move, bishop f1. But now I can take on h2. And I go knight f5, and I can't go c3 now because the bishop is defended, and he can take on c3 with the rook. So I go knight f5, and if I can swing my knight to f3, the mating threats here are very real. So he gives up his h2 pawn in exchange for the c4 pawn. Here I'm faced with the choice, do I go king h8 or do I go king f8? And it's a bit uncomfortable to put your king on h8, because in just two moves, white can execute some kind of back rank mate of his own there in the corner. But after king f8, my knight is pinned, and I lose all of my mating threats. So I go king h8. Okay, now if you're white here, how would you continue? Well, the natural move here is rook f1. But here's another cool trick that the double rooks allow you to do here. Now, I don't have the usual mating nets with rook hg2, like we saw in one of the first instructional examples, because his rook is on g3, protecting that square. But instead I can do this, rook h1 check. And I recapture his rook and fork his rook on f1 with the check, so he doesn't even have time to mate me. And after this, it's easy for me to hold the pawn while I promote my own. So instead of Rook F1, he was very careful to go Rook E1. Okay, now again, I'm faced with the decision, which pawn do I move forward to create a pocket for my king? If I move the H pawn forward, then suddenly he's the one with the power of the double rooks. And I'm the one who ends up getting checkmated, so I go G6. And he doesn't really have any mating threats, so he instead goes Rook G4, moves his rook out of danger and adds some extra protection to the D4 pawn, but I take it anyway, and now I'm threatening knight F3. We were both low on time here, so what he could have done here was probably go Rook E3 to try and stay my knight, but then I can continue with Rook HF2, and it's harder for him to control those squares, and suddenly I'm the one with the initiative here compared to this position here. Thanks to the double rooks completely dictating the terms of the game, suddenly I'm the one with the advantage. So he decides to capture the knight, which was probably his plan, and going Rook G4. And this is move 36. And I'm beginning to get low on time here too, so I check him. We go back and forth a bit. Of course, I'm hoping that he'll go King F1, and then another mating net here, I can check him. But he goes King H1. Okay, this is move 39. So I still have to make 2 more moves to meet time control. And if I had a few more moves to check him, I could have taken a long think about whether it would have been worth going into the endgame. The endgame here is taking on D4 and this. But like I mentioned before, this was a team tournament where I saw that a draw would guarantee us a win in the key matchup. And I also needed to preserve my energy for the next round, which would have taken place just a few hours later, since the tournament had a grueling double round schedule with long time controls. So this situation presents an interesting chess ethical question, if you will. If you were faced with this situation, you're about to make your 39th move, you have a minute on your clock, and you either go for the draw and help your team win, or you go into this end game, which is very low risk, but it does look like it's a draw and that you would end up grinding for a few hours to no avail. Which would you do? So here it proceeds like this. White has to put his rook behind the pawn, not in front of the pawn, because if it's in front of the pawn, then my rook can become very active and start checking the king. So he has to continue this way, try and get my rook as confined to the pawn as much as possible. And something like this would happen. And my intuition was that that would be a draw, and that that this was the time to take the perpetual. Similar situation to what happened in my game against Christopher Wu that I just went over, but the material is a lot more equal now, and it'll go into a rook ending. So I went for the draw. But in an interesting post-mortem a few days later, we find out that this endgame is in fact a theoretical draw. Black can't make any progress, and if Black tries to promote one of his pawns, he can never fully bring the rook into play because white will promote his own pawns. If black tries to bring the king over to win the a pawn, then white can win one of black's pawns by attacking it with either h1 or g1, and then once I move one of my pawns forward into a diagonal, he can use one of those weak squares by going king g5 or h5, and it's very difficult for me to make progress here, especially since these are g and h pawns and not like g and f pawns. And I won't go into, this theoretical endgame here, but the video description below should feature a link to a game between Ralston and Devereaux brought to my attention by my opponent, Alex King, which features the exact same position with colors reversed, and that game was included in Nunn's book on understanding chess endgames, demonstrating that this in fact plays out to a draw. And that's a nice nugget of chess endgame knowledge, and I was happy to learn that my intuition was vindicated. But remember, the main lesson I wanted you to draw from all of these examples is the power of the double rooks. Here, as soon as my rooks were doubled on the second rank, they created a synergy that gave me the initiative, and the course of the game changed to my favor. And if this were a must-win situation, they did give me enough of an initiative to try and make that happen. As we've seen, second-rank double rooks retain that harmonious geometric flair unique to chess. I hope that you found this video helpful in recognizing when and how to harness the power of second-rank double rooks. Thanks for watching.